Hello, welcome again. Sean Castleberry. This is my philosophical lecture shorts, and today I'm going to give you a short lecture on psychological egoism. So let's get started so we can get through this, okay? Really to start, let's just say what psychological egoism in general. It's a theory about human nature, okay? And what psychological egoists believe is that we are by nature inherently self-interested beings. That basically means this, is that any action we do is always motivated by something that I or you are going to get out of it. Okay, we will not act unless we are we get something out of it. This is in contrast to altruism, which believes that it's possible to act selflessly. And what we mean is it's possible to act in a way in which I get nothing out of a certain situation. A certain maybe thing I'm helping someone out, I can do it without getting any type of good feeling or anything like that. Okay, that's what altruism means on the other side. So when I use that term, just know what that is. Okay. Of course, many altruists believe we're not always doing selfless things, but it's at least possible. All right. The psychological egoist is trying to point out that it's impossible to do that. And think of it this way. For example, when I help an old lady across the street, I seem to be doing it just for her. But if you really think about it, what they're going to say is, don't you get a good feeling from that when you do it? So after I help her, I get the good feeling. And would you have done it if you didn't have that good feeling? Or maybe the expectation of getting money, maybe in return. Okay, that might be a little worse, but either way, you're still getting something out of it. And you're always like, no, I did it for her. It's like, but why did you do it? Okay, isn't there some type of goodness or some good feeling that you would feel? Or if you let her walk across the street and she didn't have help and was suffering, you would feel bad, like, well, I should do something. What type of person would I be if I did it? All those are directed towards yourself, okay? And so basically they're saying any action we do is always self-interested. Even something like heroes of 9/11, people who went and sacrificed their lives to help others, what the psychological egoist is going to say is they, as well, are self-interested, okay? What they mean by that is, as they were going in, they went in because they perhaps maybe said something like this, is like, well, someone had to do it, and if they weren't going to do it, I'm going to do it, okay? Basically meaning this, is if I didn't do it, I would have felt guilty, okay? What does guilt feel about? Who does that, or excuse me, where does guilt come from, and who does that affect? It affects you, okay? If you're worried about feeling guilty or not doing enough, all comes back to you, and this is why we did it. Right? Now, there may be other motives of help the others and things like this, but the egoist wants to point out that self-motivation is always there in every act we do. And in fact, it's part of human nature. The human being will not act unless they are self-motivated by something. Okay? This even goes for something like a grenade example, or the famous grenade example, which basically means this is, what happens about, what about the Marine who jumped on a grenade to save the rest of his corps, okay, or next to his group, all right? People say, that's pretty selfless, he died for that. And we'd say, okay, maybe it looks like that, if you're an egoist, looks like that on the surface. But if you really think about it, though he acted in a split second without thinking, the reason he did it is because culturally he knows that was the right thing to do. He is taught that this is what you should do, and if you don't do it, the rest of your people will die. And what would happen if you survived? How would you feel? I'd feel guilty. I'd feel wrong for not doing it. There you go, okay? Though it may be instinctual in this sense, it's still indoctrinated in us that if we don't do it, something bad will befall us, whether it's guilt, feeling bad, whatever it might be, okay? So this is a pretty strict philosophy from the egoist, basically saying that all actions are self-interested. And we can see why they could be bad to ethics, is because, or it could be, all right? Because using ethics, we think about it's a selfless thing, or doing things for others, okay? This now says everything we do is for ourselves, all right? So quickly, let's talk about a few problems with this theory here. One, I've already got these on the board here. One of the first ones here is what I call falsification, okay, or what is called falsification. Karl Popper is a philosopher of the mid-20th century. He's actually a philosopher of science. He was not really concerned about egoism, but he gives us a really good idea that we can use here, okay? And basically what falsification is, it kind of shows the difference for him between pseudoscience and actual science. Karl Popper was worried with things like what makes Freudian psychology a pseudoscience, and what makes something like Einstein's theory of relativity a science. What are the qualifications for those, okay? And basically falsification, what it means is that a scientific theory is testable. It can be proven false, okay? It could be. Now, a good scientific theory hasn't yet, but it has the ability to be proven false because you can test it. Whereas a pseudoscience, it is untestable or is unable to be falsified. So take, for example, Freud's idea of the Oedipus complex, okay? Basically, he says that all males subconsciously want to kill their father and marry their mother. Now, if Freud were to meet some male who said, you know what, I hate my mother and love my father, and I want to meet a woman like my father, even though it's almost opposite, Freud would say, well, that is just you rejecting your Oedipus complex. Or maybe if I went to the extreme and found some country that allowed me to marry my own father and I was a murderer of my mother, okay? You would be Freud, who would say, well, it's still you rejecting it. Any action we do, he can still come back to something subconscious. The question is, how could you ever test the subconscious? How could you really find out that that's really what's driving anything? You cannot. So in this case, it's pseudoscientific. Whereas we maybe take it against Einstein's theory, okay, like his one about light. We take the idea of during a solar eclipse, he predicted that the stars that we see near the sun will actually move in the sky because light bends. And then when it goes away, when the eclipse is over, they'll come back, okay? And he predicted to a particular decimal point, okay, the amount of space it would move. And guess what? In Australia, they went and tested it. They saw the light move, and it moved to the exact number that Einstein said. If it hadn't hit the exact number Einstein said, Einstein would have been wrong. You'd have to go back to the drawing board. This is why Einstein's theory is science. It can be testable. Okay? Now, what's the whole point? The whole point is this, is psychological egoism, though many times in many psychological egoists may put this out there that it's scientific, it's not. It's a pseudo-scientific philosophy. Okay? That's why you're talking about it in philosophy and not in science. All right? So don't let them trick you thinking this is a great foolproof theory. Sometimes theories that it's impossible to prove them wrong, okay, are really bad ones. Okay? For example, how are you ever going to prove that every act we do is self-interested? You can't get into the consciousness of everybody to say, this is really what's going on. They always have a likely story to say, well, at least you got something good out of it, or you're going to feel guilty. These likely stories, but how could you ever prove those things? It seemed impossible to. And so in the end, we're stuck with a pseudo-scientific theory. All right? It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's not good science. Okay? And finally, I want to kind of present this question. Are all self-interested acts selfish acts? Okay, so that means are all self-interested acts something that are wrong, are bad, or just totally self-centered? Okay, and I don't think that's the case. I think there's two ways to look at this. Actually, the way my grandfather told me one day when we were talking about this, he says, what's wrong with a win-win situation? I helped the old lady across the street. Great, I get a good feeling, but she also gets the feeling of someone helped her. She didn't get hit by the car, whatever. She got across safely. She gets something out of it. I get something out of it. What's wrong with that? A win-win situation, right? Now, it's not like I'm taking her across the street to rob her, okay? Though I'm getting something out of it, she is too. That's a more extreme sense. But if all we're getting is a good feeling, okay, and we can't help but get that good feeling, then what's the problem? Why would it be wrong, okay? Another way you could think about it is there's a common denominator we all have. That common denominator is we are all egoistic to a certain extent, that we at least wouldn't act without at least getting some good feeling from it, okay? If that's the case, and all human beings act like that, to ask me not to be selfish or self-interested would be asking me like to sprout wings and fly away right now. You're asking me to do something that is humanly impossible because it is part of my nature to be egoistic. So if that's the case, why don't we just say, okay, we being good or getting something good out of an action is the common denominator. Everyone's going to feel that way whenever they act. We can throw it out and we say the lowest amount of goodness, or like the least amount of selfishness, that type of act that we can commit, are now what we call selfless acts.